Guys, you are in for a treat today. We are putting the suspension on our 1990 GMC K1500. You've been looking at this thing in the background for a while. We finally got all the parts in and we're gonna get it put together. All right, so here's a look at our rebuilt lower control arm. And when I say rebuilt, really it's just got new bushings. So we've got new bushings in the rear and in the front, and obviously we cleaned it up and painted it as well. So this just slides right into the two pockets here in the frame. Okay. And then there are two pretty large bolts here that hold it in place. They both go in from the front. Go ahead and see if we can get this one started. Okay, that one might need a little bit of encouragement to go through. Let's see if we can get the back one in. That was a lot easier with two people to kind of push and pull on the control arm as we threaded the bolts through. And the way we finally got it in is actually threaded the long bolt through first and then threaded the short one through, because that's just a shorter distance of the control arm that it has to go through. And we were able to manipulate the control arm by pushing and pulling on it until we got everything aligned so that the bolt would come through. You can see that it's very freely moving up and down just like it should. So the next step here is to put the nuts, or the washers and the nuts on the control arms. And these nuts are kind of unique. They have a little ridge on the inside, so you want that ridge to face towards the frame. And then I'll run these nuts in a little ways. We do not want to tighten any suspension bushings until the truck is down on the ground and it has some weight on it. I'll have to get a second socket to hold the front of the bolt here. So like I was saying, we don't want to tighten these down quite yet. We just want to run the nuts on a little ways and just kind of snug things up. We'll do the final torquing once we're able to put the wheel back on and put some weight on the suspension. That should be good. We'll do the rear one now. Should be good. So you can see things are still loose, no torque on the bushings quite yet. Okay, so next up, we'll put in our lower ball joint. So here is a look at that original ball joint that we removed from the truck. And here, in comparison, is a look at the new ball joint we're gonna be putting in. So this is the Mevotech TTX line, so the Terrain Tough Extreme. These ball joints are rated really, really well. So we're excited to use them on this project. You can see how much bigger the body of that ball joint is. Obviously it also has a grease fitting. The original ball joint did not have a grease fitting. And just in your hand, you can tell this part is a lot heavier and just significantly more heavy duty than the original ball joint. So this ball joint just slides right into the lower control arm. And Mevotech supplies the new hardware, but interestingly, instead of just 4 bolts, we actually have these studs that are mounted into a plate to hold the ball joint in place. So we'll drop this whole plate down through the ball joint. There we go. And the nice thing about this plate is that we don't actually need to even put a wrench on the top here. We can just spin our nuts on the bottom, and this plate holds all of these bolts in place for us and provides actually a little bit more reinforcement on the top of this control arm as well. So here's a look at our new hardware. we'll spin all of these nuts on and torque them down as well. The torque spec on these bolts is 45 foot-pounds, so we'll go ahead and torque them down. Go across one more time. Okay, perfect. Now that we have the lower ball joint installed, we'll go ahead and install our grease fitting. So we'll pop out this cover. And Mevotech provides a couple of different grease fittings. I really like this 45-degree grease fitting. So the idea here is I'll screw it into the hole, and I want to point it down at an angle here so I'll be able to access it with the grease gun once the knuckle and everything else is on. So there'll be a small gap right here where I should be able to access it. So we'll go ahead and thread that into the ball joint. Just use a little 3/8 wrench to thread it in. Okay, so it's a little bit tedious getting it exactly where you want, and also a little bit tedious working with these 45-degree grease fittings because you can't put a socket on them. But we've got that sucker pointed down at about, probably about a 45-degree angle, and we should be able to access it right through here with our grease gun once everything's assembled. So the first time we go to service this ball joint, we're going to be really thankful we spent that time getting that grease fitting in just the right spot. We got our lower control arm completely assembled. Next up, I want to do the upper control arm. And so we're going to use Mevotech parts for the upper control arm as well. I should mention we're going to link all of these part numbers that we're using in the description below. So for the upper control arm, it's actually a lot easier than the lower control arm. And that's because you can just buy the entire control arm. So it says new bushings installed, a brand new ball joint installed, and ready to go in the truck. So we'll show you how to install this next. One thing I want to mention before we put in this upper control arm is that if you have one of these GMT400 trucks, you may notice that you do not have a slot for the upper control arm bolt. If that's the case, you may just have a hole, but from the factory, they did score this slot so you can take something like an air hammer and knock this slot out. And we actually did that on this truck before we painted the frame. And we'll cut to that video now to show you guys what that process looks like. If you want to have adjustability for your camber, knock those out. So that's going to give you a lot more flexibility when it comes time to align your truck. So I'll go at it here and it should come out fairly easily. So there we have it. It did take a little bit more hammering than I thought it would, but as long as you have an air hammer, it shouldn't be too much trouble to get those knockouts pushed out of the way. We're ready to mount this upper control arm in place. So we'll go ahead and get it started in the mounts here. There we go. And we'll want to run our eccentric bolts through the holes here to hold the upper control arm in place. Oh, wait, what's this? Oh, look at that. Brand new Mevotech eccentric bolts. So we got all new hardware for this job. So this is what an eccentric bolt looks like. So when we'll run it through the control arm, and you can either point these straight up or straight down. So when I mean straight up, that this oblong washer is pointed straight up, or you can point it straight down. And when the alignment shop goes to set the alignment, what they'll do is actually turn this bolt, and by turning this bolt, the cam here will push onto the control arm mount and actually move that control arm in and out on the truck. So I'm going to point these actually straight up on our truck. There's one. There's the second one. And on the other side, you also have an eccentric washer, followed by a lock washer and a nut. Another eccentric washer, a lock washer, and finally the nut. So just like the lower control arm, we don't want to torque these yet until we have the weight on the wheels and the control arm in the appropriate position. I'll go ahead and snug them up just a little bit, but then we'll leave them there until we have everything assembled. All right, so we've got the upper control arm mounted, and you might be thinking, geez, they just have a regular ball joint when they use that really fancy lower ball joint. Well, Mevotech actually makes a TTX line ball joint for the upper as well. So we'll actually replace this Supreme line ball joint with a TTX line ball joint. And it's actually a pretty easy swap because these ball joints are just bolted in place. We don't actually have to drill out any rivets or anything. So I'll go ahead and break all of these loose. And we'll remove the ball joint. Okay, so there we go. Just unbolted the original ball joint that came with the control arm assembly. And we'll drop in the TTX ball joint. So similar to the lower ball joint, it comes with these studs that are mounted onto a brace. So everything is held together. So we'll feed that up through the ball joint. There we go. And it also comes with all new hardware, so we've got some lock nuts here. And the final step is to torque these down. The manual calls for 18 foot-pounds. Check them all once. Okay, there we go. Next up, we will install our grease fitting in the upper ball joint. So again, we'll remove the little cover. Here we're going to use a grease fitting that points straight up and down. So get that started. And the straight grease fittings are much easier because you can just put a socket on them. We just want to tighten it down until we make contact with the ball joint. There we go. All right, so we've got the upper and lower control arms on, new ball joints in place. Next up is our steering knuckle. So we'll go ahead and get it started on the bottom stud here. And I'll use my other arm to lift the upper control arm. Get it started there as well. We'll push it through far enough to start our castle nut. There we go, we've got both started. So we'll go ahead and run those castle nuts up and then torque the ball joint studs. All right, so we're ready to torque these ball joint studs. The upper stud will go to 84 foot-pounds. We've got the torque wrench on it here. Okay, there we go, 84 foot-pounds. Oh, and we really lucked out. We're actually lined up exactly with the hole in the stud. These cotter keys are actually pretty neat too that they use. So it's a castle nut with a groove cut in it. So the cotter keys, you just stick through the hole and they snap into place. There we go. So that's the top. The bottom, we're gonna torque to 94 foot-pounds. There we go. And not quite as lucky on the bottom. We're gonna have to go about an eighth of a turn more, maybe a little bit less to get that to line up with one of the holes. Not quite there. Almost there. Just a smidge more. That should do the trick. Let's see if we get our key through. There we go. And so that'll do the bottom ball joint. So here is a look at our new hub. This is a Mevotech sealed unit. I put a little bit of high temp anti-seize around the bore where it rides inside of the steering knuckle so we can get it apart if we ever need to in the future. So the hub just slides right into the steering knuckle. Let's try a different position here. There we go. And we've got 3 holes in the front face of this hub that allow you to install your bolts. Okay, we've got the 3 bolts snugged up. The actual torque for these bolts is a bit elusive. We've seen a few different numbers. The manual that I have actually does not list a torque spec for these 3 mounting bolts. But everything we've seen online indicates that the torque spec here for these 3 bolts is 133 foot-pounds. So that's what we're going to do. One last thing before we put the CV axle in. The inside of this steering knuckle does have a seal. We actually replaced this seal off camera while the knuckle was still outside of the truck. And I did just add a little bit of high temp wheel bearing grease to the inside of that seal because that seal actually rides on the CV axle. Next up, we're going to install our CV axle. So this is actually the original CV axle, and we had it rebuilt by John at CV Source. He does a really nice job with these. I'll link his website below as well if you're looking to get your CV axle rebuilt. So we've got all new boots, and he even painted it and made it look pretty for us as well. We'll have our cameraman go underneath the truck here and help feed this CV axle up through the lower control arm. It is a little bit heavy, so it's easier to do with 2 people. I should mention I put just a little bit of high temp anti-seize on the splines of this hub as well, where the CV axle engages. That'll help us be able to service this in the future. We'll be able to get this apart a little bit easier. Now that the CV axle is in place, we'll go ahead and install the remaining inner flange bolts. I'm going to put just a drop of blue Loctite on each bolt and then torque them down to 59 foot-pounds. Okay, all 6 are torqued. Now that we've got our CV axle installed, we can install our washer on the wheel end along with our nut. So you may have been wondering, how the heck were we holding that CV axle while we were tightening those inner flange nuts? Well, what I did is just put an old set of lug nuts over our new studs so we don't damage them at all. And I'm just using a long extension here between a couple of the lug nuts and allowing it to come down and hit the lift, or if you don't have a lift, you can allow it to come down and hit the ground. And so that'll keep things from spinning. And this nut is a 36 millimeter. Okay, so we just bottomed out. So for now, I'm just gonna leave this nut snugged up. I'll do the final torque once we put the wheel back on, and we'll put the wheel down on the ground, and that'll really hold things from rotating because this nut has a very high torque spec. Next up, time to add our shocks. So we're using the period correct Bilsteins that came on the Z71 trucks. So we'll feed this up through the upper control arm into the shock mount there. And then we'll lower the entire assembly here. So we've got a block of wood holding the entire suspension assembly up. I'm going to lower that down so that I can get this lower shock mount in. Takes a little bit of muscle to get that guy in there. Okay, that took a little bit more massaging than I'd like to admit, but we got the shock absorber in. Just kind of had to work the control arms up and down, and it was just a really tight fit into these pockets as well. But everything's lined up now, so we'll go ahead and tighten our shock absorber bolts. And the final torque spec for these shock bolts is 48 foot-pounds. So we'll do the final torquing as well. And there we go. Next up, we'll install our bump stop. So this just slides into this pocket here. Got a little alignment foot and then one nut that holds it on. Next up, we're going to install our sway bar and end links. So we'll go ahead and feed the sway bar through here. And I've got somebody on the other side to catch it. Set it down. So now that we've got the sway bar fed through, we'll assemble our end links and install those next. Here's a look at the sway bar end link. So this is another Mevotech product. Basically, this consists of a long bolt that runs all the way through. You've got a flat washer at the top. Then we have these two rubber bushings or grommets, and these will sandwich the sway bar between them. Then we have another flat washer, a spacer, a flat washer, two more of these rubber bushings, and these two will sandwich the lower control arm, and then finally another washer and a nut. So that's what the assembly looks like before we put it on the truck. Before you get started, I did notice that the washers that come with these sway bar end links will not fit through the hole in the bottom of the lower control arm. So I think you really have two options. You can grind this washer down a little bit and make the diameter smaller, or you can come up to the end of the lower control arm and actually feed the washer into the end here and then kind of push it down. So there you go. Now I've got the washer on the inside of the lower control arm. Okay, we'll start by feeding the bolt with just a single washer and a single rubber bushing through the sway bar. We'll add another rubber bushing and another washer. And then our spacer. I did coat the inside of the spacer with anti-seize to try to keep it from rusting to the bolt itself. Then we'll add another washer. Another rubber bushing. And then we'll feed the whole assembly through the lower control arm. So for the bottom bolt, or for the bottom nut here, it's a little bit tricky. Obviously we already have the washer in there, but prior to putting that washer on, we need to feed this rubber bushing onto that bolt. And then once we have this rubber bushing in place, I found this setup here to work is basically feed the nut over a screwdriver, grab this washer here on the bottom with that screwdriver, and then push that whole assembly up onto the bolt itself and get the nut started on that sway bar bolt. That seemed to work on the other side. There's not a lot of room to work under here, so we probably won't get that on film, but just to show you guys how we're doing it. So we'll go ahead and tighten down the sway bar end links. The torque spec here is 13 foot-pounds. So as you tighten it, the rubber is obviously squishing down, so it doesn't really tighten up very fast. Oops. I'm gonna have to switch to a deep well. Okay, we've switched out to a deep well socket. We'll continue torquing. 13 foot-pounds. Once you have it tightened, you'll notice quite a bit of the bolt coming through the nut. And that's just because the rubber does squish quite a bit as you torque it down to 13 foot-pounds. It's time for the tie rods. We're using the TTX line tie rods. These things are really nice. They come with a powder coated finish. Unfortunately, we tried to thread it into the tie rod sleeve and it's really, really tight. So on the other side, I used the wire brush here to remove some of this powder coat off the threads, and it threaded in much, much nicer. So we'll show you what that looks like. And then in the next segment, we'll show you the entire tie rod assembly all put together. Here's a look at the entire steering assembly before we put it back into the truck. So we have a brand new Mevotech center link, new inner tie rod. This is a TTX line tie rod, new outer tie rod, also TTX line. And these tie rod sleeves are actually made by Cunningham machines. So he provided those to us for the video. And they're really nice compared to your stock style sleeve, which is just this clamp style sleeve. You can also see, I mean, just visually in this video, how much bigger these tie rods are. So the body of the tie rod is much bigger than the stock unit, and the shaft here of the tie rod is also much, much bigger than the stock unit. We did measure the total length here. So we measured from the center of the inner tie rod to the center of the outer tie rod and matched it up to the original measurements so that our alignment will be pretty close. Obviously, we'll still have to take the truck into the alignment shop, but this should get us pretty close. And the inner tie rods here, we already have the castle nut installed and torqued to 40 foot-pounds. So this assembly is ready to go back into the truck. Okay, so here is our new steering assembly. I'm gonna feed this through. We've got a couple people here to help so we can get all of the pieces kind of snugged into position before we torque it down. And now all four of these are going to be torqued to 40 foot-pounds. So both the outer tie rods and the pitman and the idler arm will all be 40 foot-pounds. We'll check and see if we're aligned with one of the holes. Oh, we lucked out. We're lined up perfectly. So we'll put our key in. I do really like these Mevotech keys as well. They just snap in place. There we go. That's that side. Okay, next up we'll do the idler arm, also 40 foot-pounds. Okay. And we are using an extension, so we'll go a little bit beyond. We're not quite lined up at the hole anyway, so we'll go ahead and spin it till maybe another 1/8 of a turn till we line up at the hole. There we go. And we'll put our cotter pin through. All right, there we go. I know what you guys were thinking. I did a really crappy job on that cotter key, but I just wanted to show you I did finish it off. All right, moving on now to the pitman arm. Again, 40 foot-pounds. And we are not lined up. There you go. Comment below about my cotter key installation technique. Now finally, the driver's side tie rod. You guys might be thinking, geez, does this truck even have a driver's side? Because we're always showing you the passenger side, but see, now you can see we did everything on this side too. Oh, perfectly lined up. Got lucky twice. There we go. We got our new sway bar bushings here. These are also made by Mevotech. Before we install this, I'm gonna put just a little bit of synthetic grease on the inside of them so that the sway bar can slide back and forth. Put a little dab of grease there and rub it around. Now the gap on the sway bar bushings, the gap is supposed to go towards the front of the truck. Just like that. So we just lifted the control arm up to bring that bushing into contact with the frame. And then we'll go ahead and install our clamp. And the torque spec for these bolts is 24 foot-pounds. There we go. All right, so the next step is to install the torsion springs. So we're back underneath the truck. The torsion springs go into the lower control arms. They are labeled left and right at the front of the torsion spring. And we'll show you a picture of that in the video here. But we're gonna go ahead and slide it into position now. So you'll wanna slide these almost all the way forward, maybe even out of the front of the control arm so that we can get the cross member in, which is the next step. So with the torsion bars in place, we're ready to put our cross member back in. But before you slide your cross member in, there is a rubber isolator that goes over the end of the cross member. So we'll go ahead and pop that into place. And there's one that goes on each end. All right, so time to put our cross member back in place. So the best way I've found to do this is actually put it in upside down. So we'll get it started upside down like that. Slide it back into position. And once it's in the truck, we can flip it over. And this takes just a little bit of finagling. You should be able to get it. Actually, I think I need to rotate the other way. And there we go. Okay, so now that we've got our cross member in place, the first thing is this spacer that goes through that rubber isolator. So you can drop that down from the top. Then we've got a top plate that goes over the rubber isolator. And I'll install the center bolt first. So I put a little bit of anti-seize on the shank of the bolt where it goes through that spacer. And we'll put a nut on the top. We've got our two outer bolts as well. And then we'll torque everything in position. Okay, we're putting in our torsion springs. Here is a look at the torsion spring key. So this will just slide up inside of the cross member. And I've got a little bit of anti-seize on the end of the torsion bar just to keep everything from rusting together. So we'll go ahead and slide this into position. go. And then we'll get our torsion key removal tool on here to rotate the key up so that we can get our keeper in place. We've got our torsion bar unloading tool in place. So we'll go ahead and thread that up into the second divot on the key. So that should be high enough to get our little cross brace in. There we go. And the adjuster bolt. And on this side, we want to run the key up until we have 1 1/8 inches of bolt exposed. So we need to go up quite a bit more. Actually almost there, about 1.25 inches. And again, this is the measurement just on our truck. Yours might be different. You should either mark this or measure it before you remove it. So I actually like that right there. I'm going to lower it down. And now the adjusting bolt is holding all the tension from the torsion bar, and we'll remove the tool. We've got the wheels back on the truck. We've bounced it up and down a little bit to settle the suspension. We've also rolled the truck back and forth about 1 foot. So it's now time to tighten the lower control arm pivot bolts. The torque spec on these bolts for the 88 to 90 trucks is 135 foot-pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten those up right now. Then we'll go ahead and do the upper control arms as well. And the torque spec on these for the 88 to 90 trucks is 88 foot-pounds. Final step is to grease all of the fittings. So we'll start by pulling off the covers and attaching our grease gun. And then I'll go underneath and let you guys have a look at how that boot swells as we add grease. Here's a look at that upper ball joint. I did want to point out there's a small relief valve in the back of these TTX ball joints. And what that allows is for the grease to escape from the boot. So if you do overfill it with grease, we should get a little bit of grease coming out of that tiny little relief valve rather than bursting the boot itself. So I'll go ahead and leave the film on and pump a little bit of grease in, and we should see the boot probably swell just a little bit and maybe even see some grease come out of that relief valve. There we go. I saw the boot starting to swell a little bit. And we've got just a tiny bit of grease coming out of our relief valve as well. So if I push on the boot here, we can get a little bit more out as well. So I think that's a really nice design, and I just wanted to point that out. Obviously we have to go around and do the lower ball joints and tie rods as well, but the procedure is the same. All right guys, front suspension's back on the truck. Next video, we're gonna tackle the front brakes. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.